The Dweller in Darkness by August Derleth. Chapter 1. Until recently, if a traveler in north-central Wisconsin took the left fork at the junction of the Brule River Highway and the Chewagamon Pike on the way to Pashapaho, he would find himself in country so primitive that it would seem remote from all human contact. If he drove on along the little-used road, he might, in time, pass a few tumble-down shacks where presumably people had once lived and which have long ago been taken back by the encroaching forest. It is not desolate country, but an area thick with growth, and over all its expanse there persists an intangible aura of the sinister, a kind of ominous oppression of the spirit, quickly manifest to even the most casual traveler. For the road he has taken becomes ever more and more difficult to travel, and is eventually lost just short of a deserted lodge built on the edge of a clear blue lake around which century-old trees brood eternally, a country where the only sounds are the cries of the owls, the whippoorwills, and the eerie loons at night, and the wind's voice in the trees, But is it always the wind's voice in the trees? And who can say whether the snapped twig is the sign of an animal passing, or of something more, some other creature beyond man's ken? For the forest surrounding the abandoned lodge at Rick's Lake had a curious reputation long before I myself knew it, a reputation which transcended similar stories about similar primeval places. There were odd rumors about something that dwelt in the depths of the forest's darkness, by no means the conventional wild whisperings of ghosts, of something half animal, half man, fearsomely spoken of by such natives as inhabited the edges of that region, and referred to only by stubborn head-shakings among the Indians who occasionally came out of that country and made their way south. The forest had an evil reputation. It was nothing short of that, and already, before the turn of the century, it had a history that gave pause even to the most intrepid adventurer. The first record of it was left in the writings of a missionary on his way through that country to come to the aid of a tribe of Indians reported to the post at Chewagamon Bay in the north to be starving. Friar Pierregard vanished, but the Indians later brought in his effects, a sandal, his rosary, and a prayer book in which he had written certain curious words which had been carefully preserved. I have the conviction that some creature is following me. I thought at first it was a bear, but I am now compelled to believe that it is something incredibly more monstrous than anything on this earth. Darkness is falling, and I believe I have developed a slight delirium, for I persist in hearing strange music and other curious sounds which can surely not derive from any natural source. There is also a disturbing illusion, as of great footsteps which actually shake the earth, and I have several times encountered a very large footprint which varies in shape. The second record is far more sinister. When Big Bob Hiller, one of the most rapacious lumber barons of the entire Midwest, began to encroach upon the Rick's Lake country in the middle of the last century, he could not fail to be impressed by the stand of pine in the area near the lake, and though he did not own it, he followed the usual custom of the lumber barons and sent his men in from an adjoining piece he did own, under the intended explanation that he did not know where his line ran. 13 men failed to return from that first day's work on the edge of the forest area surrounding Rick's Lake. 2 of their bodies were never recovered, or were found, inconceivably, in the lake, several miles from where they had been cutting timber. The others were discovered at various places in the forest. Hiller thought he had a lumber war on his hands, laid his men off to mislead his unknown opponent, and then suddenly ordered them back to work in the forbidden region. After he had lost 5 more men, Hiller pulled out, and no hand since his time touched the forest, save for 1 or 2 individuals who took up land there and moved into the area. One and all, these individuals moved out within a short time, saying little but hinting much. Yet the nature of their whispered hints was such that they were soon forced to abandon any explanation. So incredible were the tales they told, with overtones of something too horrible for description, of age-old evil which preceded anything dreamed of even by the most learned archaeologist. Only one of them vanished, and no trace of him was ever found. The others came back out of the forest, and in the course of time were lost somewhere among other people in the United States, all save a half-breed known as Old Peter, who was obsessed with the idea that there were mineral deposits in the vicinity of the wood and occasionally went to camp on its edge, being careful not to venture in. It was inevitable that the Ricks Lake legends would ultimately reach the attention of Professor Upton Gardner of the State University. He had completed collections of Paul Bunyan, Whiskey Jack, and Hodag tales, and was engaged upon a compilation of place legends when he first encountered the curious, half-forgotten tales that emanated from the region of Ricks Lake. I discovered later that his first reaction to them was one of casual interest. Legends abound in out-of-the-way places, and there was nothing to indicate that these were of any more import than others. True, there was no similarity in the strictest sense of the word to the more familiar tales, for while the usual legends concern themselves with ghostly appearances of men and animals, lost treasure, tribal beliefs, and the like, those of Ricks Lake were curiously unusual in their insistence upon utterly outre creatures, or a creature, since no one had ever reported seeing more than one, even vaguely, in the forest's darkness, half man, half beast, with always the hint that this description was inadequate, in that it did injustice to the narrator's concept of what it was that lurked there in the vicinity of the lake. Nevertheless, Professor Gardner would in all probability have done little more than add the legends as he heard them to his collection, if it had not been for the reports, seemingly unconnected, of two curious facts, and the accidental discovery of a third. The two facts were both newspaper accounts carried by Wisconsin papers within a week of each other. The first was a terse, half-comic report headed "Sea Serpent in Wisconsin Lake," and read, "Pilot Joseph X. Castleton, on test flight over northern Wisconsin yesterday, reported seeing a large animal of some kind bathing by night in a forest lake in the vicinity of Chequamegon." Castleton was caught in a thundershower and was flying low at the time when, in an effort to ascertain his whereabouts, he looked down when lightning flashed and saw what appeared to be a very large animal rising from the waters of a lake below him and vanish into the forest. The pilot added no details to his story, but asserts that the creature he saw was not the Loch Ness Monster. The second story was the utterly fantastic tale of the discovery of the body of Friar Pierregard, well preserved in the hollow trunk of a tree along the Brule River. At first called a lost member of the Marquette Joliet expedition, Friar Pierregard was quickly identified. To this report was appended a frigid statement by the president of the State Historical Society dismissing the discovery as a hoax. The discovery Professor Gardner made was simply that an old friend was actually the owner of the abandoned lodge and most of the shore of Ricks Lake. The sequence of events was thus clearly inevitable. Professor Gardner instantly associated both newspaper accounts with the Ricks Lake legends. This might not have been enough to stir him to drop his researches into the general mass of legends abounding in Wisconsin for specific research of quite another kind, but the occurrence of something even more astonishing sent him post-haste to the owner of the abandoned lodge for permission to take the place over in the interests of science. What spurred him to take this action was nothing less than a request from the curator of the State Museum to visit his office late one night and view a new exhibit which had arrived. He went there in the company of Laird Dorgan, and it was Laird who came to me. But that was after Professor Gardner vanished. For he did vanish, after sporadic reports from Ricks Lake over a period of 3 months. All word from the lodge ceased entirely, and nothing further was heard of Professor Upton Gardner. Laird came to my room at the University Club late one night in October. His frank blue eyes were clouded, his lips tense, his brow furrowed, and there was everything to show that he was in a state of moderate excitation, which did not derive from liquor. I assumed that he was working too hard. The first period tests in his University of Wisconsin classes were just over, and Laird habitually took tests seriously. Even as a student he had done so, and now as an instructor he was doubly conscientious. But it was not that. Professor Gardiner had been missing almost a month now, and it was this which preyed on his mind. He said as much in so many words, adding, "Jack, I've got to go up there and see what I can do." "Man, if the sheriff and the posse haven't discovered anything, what can you do?" I asked. "For one thing, I know more than they do." "If so, why didn't you tell them?" "Because it's not the sort of thing they'd pay any attention to." "Legends?" "No." He was looking at me speculatively, as if wondering whether he could trust me. I was suddenly conscious of the conviction that he did know something which he, at least, regarded with the gravest concern. And at the same time I had the most curious sensation of premonition and warning that I'd ever experienced. In that instant the entire room seemed tense, the air electrified. "If I go up there, do you think you could go along?" "I guess I could manage." "Good." He took a turn or two about the room, his eyes brooding, looking at me from time to time, still betraying uncertainty and an inability to make up his mind. "Look, Laird, sit down and take it easy. That caged lion stuff isn't good for your nerves." He took my advice. He sat down, covered his face with his hands, and shuddered. For a moment I was alarmed, but he snapped out of it in a few seconds, leaned back, and lit a cigarette. "You know those legends about Rick's Lake, Jack?" I assured him that I knew them and the history of the place from the beginning, as much as had been recorded. "And those stories in the papers I mentioned to you?" The stories, too. I remembered them, since Laird had discussed with me their effect on his employer. "That second one, about Friar Pierregard," he began, hesitated, stopped. But then, taking a deep breath, he began again. "You know, Gardiner and I went over to the curator's office one night last spring." "Yes, I was east at the time." "Of course. Well, we went over there. The curator had something to show us. What do you think it was?" "No idea. What was it?" "That body in the tree." "No." "Gave us quite a jolt. There it was, hollow trunk and all, just the way it had been found. It had been shipped down to the museum for exhibition, but it was never exhibited, of course, for a very good reason. When Gardiner saw it, he thought it was a waxwork, but it wasn't." "You don't mean that it was the real thing?" Laird nodded. "I know. It's incredible." "It's just not possible." "Well, yes, I suppose it's impossible, but it was so. That's why it wasn't exhibited. Just taken out and buried." "I don't quite follow that." He leaned forward and said very earnestly, "Because when it came in, it had all the appearance of being completely preserved, as if by some natural embalming process. It wasn't. It was frozen. It began to thaw out that night, and there were certain things about it that indicated that Friar Pierregard hadn't been dead the 3 centuries history said he had. The body began to go to pieces in a dozen ways, but no crumbling into dust, nothing like that. Gardiner estimated that he hadn't been dead over 5 years. Where had he been in the meantime?" He was quite sincere. I would not at first have believed it. But there was a certain disquieting earnestness about Laird that forbade any levity on my part. If I had treated his story as a joke, as I had the impulse to do, he would have shut up like a clam and walked out of my room to brood about this thing in secret, with Lord knows what harm to himself. For a little while I said absolutely nothing.
You don't believe it.
I haven't said so.
I can feel it.
No, it's hard to take. Let's say I believe in your sincerity.
That's fair enough, he said grimly. Do you believe in me sufficiently to go along up to the lodge and find out what may have happened there?
Yes, I do.
But I think you'd better read these excerpts from Gardiner's letters first.
He put them down on my desk like a challenge. He had copied them off onto a single sheet of paper, and as I took this up, he went on, talking rapidly, explaining that the letters had been those written by Gardiner from the lodge. When he finished, I turned to the excerpts and read. I cannot deny that there is about the lodge, the lake, even the forest, an aura of evil, of impending danger. It is more than that, Laird, if I could explain it, but archaeology is my forte, and not fiction. For it would take fiction, I think, to do justice to this thing I feel. Yes, there are times when I have the distinct feeling that someone or something is watching me out of the forest or from the lake. There does not seem to be a distinction as I would like to understand it, and while it does not make me uneasy, nevertheless it is enough to give me pause. I managed the other day to make contact with old Peter, the half-breed. He was, at the moment, a little the worse for firewater, but when I mentioned the lodge and the forest to him, he drew into himself like a clam. But he did put words to it. He called it the Wendigo. You are familiar with this legend, which properly belongs to the French-Canadian country. That was the first letter, written about a week after Gardiner had reached the abandoned lodge on Rick's Lake. The second was extremely terse and had been sent by special delivery. Will you wire Miskatonic University at Arkham, Massachusetts, to ascertain if there is available for study a photostatic copy of a book known as the Necronomicon by an Arabian writer who signs himself Abdul al-Hazred. Make inquiry also for the Pnakotic manuscripts and the Book of Ibn, and determine whether it is possible to purchase through one of the local bookstores a copy of The Outsider and Others by H.P. Lovecraft, published by Arkham House last year. I believe that these books, individually and collectively, may be helpful in determining just what it is that haunts this place. For there is something, make no mistake about that. I am convinced of it, and when I tell you that I believe it has lived here, not for years, but for centuries, perhaps even before the time of man, you will understand that I may be on the threshold of great discoveries. Startling as this letter was, the third was even more so. For an interval of a fortnight went by between the second and third letters, and it was apparent that something had happened to threaten Professor Gardiner's composure, for his third letter was, even in this selected excerpt, marked by extreme perturbation. Everything evil here. I don't know whether it is the black goat with 1,000 young, or the faceless one, and or something more that rides the wind. For God's sake, those accursed fragments! Something in the lake, too, and at night, the sounds! How still, and then suddenly, those horrible flutes, those watery ululations! Not a bird, not an animal, then, only those ghastly sounds, and the voices! Or is it but dream? Is it my own voice I hear in the darkness? I found myself increasingly shaken as I read those excerpts. Certain implications and hints lodged between the lines of what Professor Gardiner had written were suggestive of terrible, ageless evil, and I felt that there was opening up before Laird Dorgan and myself an adventure so incredible, so bizarre, and so unbelievably dangerous that we might well not return to tell it. Yet even then there was a lurking doubt in my mind that we would say anything about what we found at Rick's Lake.
"What do you say?"
asked Laird impatiently. "I'm going."
"Good. Everything's ready. I've even got a dictaphone and batteries enough to run it. I've arranged for the sheriff of the county at Pashapaho to replace Gardiner's notes and to leave everything just the way it was."
"The dictaphone?" I broke in. "What for?"
"Those sounds he wrote about. We can settle that once and for all. If they're there to be heard, the dictaphone will record them. If they're just imagination, it won't."
He paused, his eyes very grave.
"You know, Jack, we may not come out of this thing."
"I know." I did not say so, because I knew that Laird, too, felt the same way I did, that we were going like two dwarfed Davids to face an adversary greater than any Goliath, an adversary invisible and unknown, who bore no name and was shrouded in legend and fear, a dweller not only of the darkness of the wood, but in that greater darkness which the mind of man has sought to explore since his dawn.